What is the crack, everyone? It's Nathan here, aka the Rambling Kern, and head instructor of Kern School of Combat. So, just recently, and actually quite frequently, I get asked to do videos covering the topic of female clothing during the Renaissance and medieval period in Ireland. And the only reason that I haven't done this yet is because it is actually quite a large and extensive subject. So it's something that I kind of wanted to give proper due diligence to. Now, what I'm going to do with this is actually break this down into a series of videos covering specific periods. I am covering individual garments with the Kern clothing series. If you haven't watched any of those, feel free to browse on my channel. I've covered the Lena and various other clothing items, so feel free to check those out. And if there's any specific items that you'd like me to cover, please do let me know. But when it comes to ladies' clothing, the items themselves generally remain the same, yet change dramatically as time periods go. So what I mean by that is, generally you're going to see gowns for women right the way through the medieval period, from the early medieval period, kind of the earliest records we have, up into the Renaissance period. Ladies are generally wearing the same series of clothing, yet these do change, but more so the actual styles and specific details of them change. Now, I am by no means a clothing historian, and there's probably very specific details I may leave out, so I do apologise for it. However, I will do my best to cover in this video the clothing that you would expect to see of an Irish lady during the 16th century in Ireland. So, on that note, in the 16th century, starting off from, I guess, the underlayers and working our way out, because it's the most straightforward, you would have seen what was essentially an underdress. There's no kind of surviving examples of these. However, these generally were linen, usually quite light. This would have been the clothing that would have been swapped out quite regularly, because it's what's worn next to the skin, and it would, being linen, would wash and dry quickly and easily. And these are quite similar throughout the early medieval period into the Renaissance period. However, in the Renaissance period in the 16th century, they start to become quite specific. Now, one thing that you actually do see common amongst men and women is the Lena. Now, as I say, I've done a previous video on this, so I do recommend you check that out. Ladies did wear the Lena, however, from what I've gathered and from what I can find in my own research, there's no references to the ladies wearing these with the traditional saffron yellow colour. More often than not, it seems to be white from any of the references that I've been able to find. There is in some artwork what look like yellow Lena. Now, I don't know if these are. So as I am covering this series, I will show some images here on screen as I'm talking about these things. So you will see in some of these, they do look quite similar to Lena, just with regards to the sleeves. However, various different artworks have showed these quite differently. So the one great thing that I've mentioned throughout this series about Ireland is that the island is covered in bogs, and that makes actual surviving examples of clothing something that is actually possible, which is phenomenal. So we do have two really amazing examples of clothing within the 16th century for ladies, two very specific dresses, the Muay Gown and the Shinron gown. Now, one of these is basically remnants, yet we've been able to piece together what it is, and the second is almost perfectly intact, bar just one sleeve missing. Again, I'll be showing images of these as I go. However, I wanted to do these proper justice and actually read some descriptions from people who have had the opportunity to actually handle and see these. So, what I wanted to do was touch on these. So, first off is the Shinron gown. Now, this one is generally dated to the late 16th century to the early 17th century, so basically the 1550 to 1650, somewhere in that region. It was found in Tipperary in 1843, and it is in immaculate condition. Like I said, the only thing really missing off this one is the sleeve. So while there is not that many very good pictures of it, I will show them on the screen, and you will see some of the details of them. There's a fantastic picture of the back of it. However, However, it's quite difficult to find one with good detail of the front. However, a few people have done very, very good reconstructions of this, so I will show those on screen as I go as well. So, from McLintock, fantastic book on Irish clothing that I really recommend checking out as well. So this was described in 1950, and this is how it was described. So it is a coarse dark brown woolen homespun and consists of a bodice and a skirt joined together. The bodice has a square opening in the front, and the skirt, which measures about 22.5 feet round at the bottom, is made of 23 pieces of cloth or gauze seamed together, each about a foot wide at the bottom, narrower at the top. Each of these gauze in turn has 3 separate quills or cylindrical folds running down from the top to the bottom at equal distance from each other, together with 4 quill at its edge, so arranged as to conceal the seam which joins the gore to its neighbour. The effect thus produced of 92 separate gores about 3 inches wide at the bottom and 2 inches at the top. At the top, the skirt is drawn by a multitude of small gathers, each held in place by a back stitch onto the inside of the garment, and is there sewn onto a separate bodice. So one thing that you do see in Ireland, and this is quite common across Europe at the time, is clothing which, to denote status. In certain parts of Europe, this is done through more rarer items, such as silk or velvet. However, in Ireland, one thing that you do see, which comes across in various statutes that are put against the Lena, is voluminous clothing. In other words, clothing which requires a huge amount of linen or wool. So these gowns are a really terrific example of huge amounts of volume within the actual skirt itself. What was the exact detail there? 22.5 feet. That is a lot of cloth to walk around with, especially when it comes to wool. So one of the ways to denote status in Ireland obviously is through the finery of your clothing. And one thing that you do see with both male and female clothing is, and this is actually even written into statutes with regards to the Lena, again mentioned in my previous video, of the higher in status, the more cloth that you can actually wear. So it's a really interesting thing to note. So that is the Shinron gown. Now next up is the Muay Gown. So the Muay Gown was found in a bog in Muay, County Clare, in 1931. And this is described by Mairead Dunleavy in 1989, and she describes the gown as a coarsely woven twill of lightly spun wool, and may have had some slight felting on the inner surface. It has a low round neckline with a bodice buttoned at the centre, front, and tight sleeves buttoned to underarms. The skirt shaped with a double gore at centre, back, and at either side. The front of the skirt did not survive. This Muay gown is of interest since it shows the sewing techniques of the time. Selvages were used when possible, otherwise the fabric edge was thickened to avoid ravelling. All seams were welted, but the neckline was finished neatly with a back stitch on the inner face, and the bodice fronts were hemmed. The seams of the skirts were sometimes left unfinished towards the bottom, and the lower edge of which is so fragmentary that it would be unwise to conjecture as to whether it was ankle or calf length. The difficulties surmounted in accommodating the sleeves are of interest. The fabric was wrapped around the arm and cut to extend close to the neck. A welted seam attached this to the body of the gown and continued into the sleeve. In this way, the weakness of a shoulder seam was avoided. For further strength, the 2 foreparts of the bodice were cut with narrow straps which extended over the shoulders and into triangular gussets between the shoulder blades. A gusset was placed at the front of each armpit for ease of movement and comfort. So, like I mentioned, the Muay gown itself is fragmentary, so basically pieces of it have been found. It's not near as good condition as the Shinron gown, but it, as mentioned, gives us a really good insight into the methods used to create these clothing items at the time. And one interesting thing here that you'll see mentioned is the buttons on the sleeve. Now you actually see these in artwork used to wear sleeves outside of the dress itself. These could be Lena, these could be Houpenland. I don't really know French, the proper French pronunciation. If anyone can please explain that one to me, please do let me know. There's been numerous different reconstruction attempts at this. Actually, even some friends of mine I know have tried to reconstruct it. Really interesting dress itself. And both of these dresses do share quite similar cut and shape, although obviously, like I mentioned, there are specific details that are different, which is why I wanted to read off those accounts, because I am not a seamstress, so there's certain details in there for those who make clothes that I think you may appreciate that I would be completely oblivious to. Now, moving on to an area that I do tend to somewhat understand is the actual material and artistic examples of clothing that we have. So when it comes to lady clothing, we have, or female clothing I should say, we have a number of secondary sources. So one of them that we see in a few different artworks, such as Lucas de Hare's work, is the coat tucked up. So this is basically a coat which constitutes of a V-shaped neckline, front lacing to the top of the breast, a scarf tucked around the neck, sometimes paired with a partlet, particularly for older and more upper class women, either a full sleeve with contrasting sleeve turned back or an Irish half hanging sleeve, and the underside of the coat that is contrasting colour to both the outside and the colour of the coat and the colour of the underskirt. A narrow belt is then worn around the middle of the waist. The two front corners of the gown, or the front two corners and the back, can be tucked into that belt. Now I'll show some pictures of that so you understand what I'm talking about. This is just a particular way of wearing this coat. These coats were, as far as I can see, quite common across Europe, but this way of wearing them is quite particular to Ireland and quite interesting in that regard. So the other things that you'll see as well is the high-waisted gown. These generally consist of a short, low-necked bodice that's laced at the front, and similar skirt, similar to kind of some of the other gowns that you'd see as well. And finally, some of the other things that I want to touch on. While there is a number of other gowns, there is actually a certain number of hats that you would see as well, such as the onion hat and the other hat, which name escapes me, but I'll show on screen here. And these were quite common amongst ladies. You'll see these in a number of artworks, and quite common in the Christian world was that the head would be covered, especially for women. So you see in most artworks women do have their heads covered. And in Ireland there was a number of hats that were worn at the time specifically by women. Now, like I said, that is quite a brief overview, and that is really pertaining to the 16th century. If there is any particular areas you'd like me to cover in future, please do let me know. If you have any questions with regards to that, please do let me know. Leave a comment down below. If there's anything you'd like to see in future, do let me know. And please do like, comment, and especially subscribe. We're closing in on that 1,000 mark, and it's a real big milestone I'm hoping to hit this summer. And I'd really appreciate any support that you can give, even if you can share this video. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and Slán.